Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask the provocative question of how politics could appear in our preaching this week. My name is Thomas. I'm one of JPIT's interns for 2025 to 2026, and I'm working on the Constituency Action Network, or CAN, JPIT's network of churches engaging positively and purposefully with their MPs. Please see our website for more information on the network. And today's guest is Aniko Schuetz Bradwell. Welcome.
Thank you. Lovely to be here.
She is a Church of Scotland parish minister in Lammermuir Church, a rural parish of 7 villages in a farming area of East Lothian, where she has been for just over 10 years and lives with her husband, who occasionally works at the JPIT as part of the Church of Scotland, and their son, as well as 2 cats, a guinea pig, and a flock of hens. She came to Scotland 20 years ago from her native East Germany, where she studied literature and religious studies. She's worked with the Taizé and Iona Communities before working in the head office of the Church of Scotland in Edinburgh. She studied and trained for ministry in Edinburgh with, among others, a training placement in the Church of Scotland's churches in the Holy Land. And joining us from JPIT today is Adam Alcock, JPIT's advocacy coordinator. Hello, Adam.
Hello, thanks for having me back.
Okay, so we'll start with the question we always start with on politics in the pulpit. Does politics belong in the pulpit?
Yeah, I don't think we can really leave it out. I always think that our faith informs how we live our life, and our life informs our faith. And so what we experience and what we see in the world shapes our views and our choices, and ultimately how we choose to live our life. And so much of what Jesus teaches us is political. It's about public life, about living together in a community as a community, and that is necessarily political.
Great. Thank you for that. I think that was nice and concise, Aniko, and I agree wholeheartedly. Let's set the context for our discussion by having a look at the news headlines. Now, always a disclaimer, we record this ahead of time, so these might be slightly outdated, although I think all of these issues may still be relevant when you're listening. There has been a meningitis outbreak at the University of Kent, leading to vaccine sites opening across the country. There have been Israeli airstrikes on Tehran during Persian New Year celebrations. And Labour MPs are threatening a vote in Parliament to show opposition to proposed immigration reforms from the government, including doubling time for migrants to gain indefinite leave to remain. And our lectionary readings for this Easter Sunday include Acts 10, verses 34 to 43, Psalms 118, verses 1 to 2 and 14 to 24, Colossians 3, verses 1 to 4, and John 20, verses 1 to 18. And the awareness days, of course, it is Easter Sunday, and it is also World Autism Awareness Day on the 2nd of April, and it's Bowel Cancer Awareness Month. So with all that in mind, let's have a look at the texts. Let's go through one by one. We'll start with Acts chapter 10, verses 34 to 43. Any immediate reflections or takeaways? We'll start with you, Aniko.
Yeah, I think it's a really rich passage, really. There is so much in there that on first reading, perhaps I hadn't quite picked up on, but then when you look at it in detail, there is so much in there. So, of course, we do have a statement of universality. God is there for everyone in every nation. Everyone is acceptable to God. Jesus is Lord of all. So incredibly strong on this message of, everybody counts the same. Everybody is accepted by God. So we've got all of that. Also that there is no hierarchy with that, and in the context of the reading in the Roman society, there was so much of a hierarchy of citizenship, ethnicity, and also the Jewish context. We have a lot in Acts still about distinctions between the new Jewish Christians and the Gentiles. So again, you have that distinction there, and people are being sorted in some ways, whereas, this reading says they really shouldn't be. And even if you look at the context of the reading, in that we've got Peter, who is obviously a Jewish Christian, in the home of Cornelius, who is a Roman military officer. And I think it would have been quite unusual for them to come together in a domestic space. And so, it's a great example of those divisions can be broken down and we can come together. So both the context and what the reading specifically says in that. And there's a lot about, an example that Jesus gives us. He preaches peace. He went about doing good and healing all who were oppressed by the devil, or by evil, as we might choose to say. So, yeah, a lot about when we look at the world then and the world today, that, this message of peace really comes into.
Thank you. Yeah. Adam, would you like to come in on any of those points?
Yes, unsurprisingly, I've read the same, that kind of the universality and the kind of lack of partiality, or my Bible says like favoritism, and yeah, that idea that it's beyond nations, and that the time that this is being written, as you said, is a time where there were kind of barriers for Jewish Christians in how they spread the words to Gentiles. And we look at the world today, and there are those barriers of how we see one another, whether that's by language or ethnicity, or by kind of cultural affiliation. And so we see that in politics today, and in some of the news stories that you spoke about at the beginning, Thomas, about the kind of potential Labour revolt, about some of the immigration reforms, and that's something that JPIT has kind of spoken out about. And I was challenged, and then reconciled my challenge, perhaps, about that lack of partiality, because and perhaps unsurprisingly, given where I work, quite a lot of my understanding of things is God's particular care for people who have been marginalized and are vulnerable and are oppressed. But then when we look at, I think is it the parable of the workers in the vineyard and things, of people being kind of brought up to the kind of same level, that everybody is given enough to kind of meet that kind of equal that level. And so while there isn't that kind of that partiality, there is still perhaps more to be done for marginalized and for vulnerable people. And so this week, as JPIT, we are, and this will be in the past for people listening, but it's still something we're going to be campaigning on. We are handing in a letter about refugee family reunion, and about particularly how that impacts children of refugee families, perhaps some of the most vulnerable people in our society, being kind of that both children and refugees, and sometimes kind of unaccompanied, so they're kind of alone in dangerous situations. And so I think when we look at this kind of favoritism, and that ties into the ideas of the word and his love spreads across kind of nations and across barriers that we might see in society today, but also keeping in mind that kind of fierce defense of vulnerable and persecuted people.
Yeah, I think especially at Easter, this passage of, as you've been saying, that universality of equality, the lack of partiality is particularly important. I'm sure that's why it's in the lectionary, that we really think of the good news of Christ's resurrection for everybody, and what does that mean in our context. I think especially when we look at the context of war and violence, and that was in our news headlines as well, about the ongoing violence with Iran and Israel and in the wider Middle Eastern and North African region. It's really important to center ourselves in this sort of passage to think about that universality, as you've both said. Is there anything else you'd like to pick up on or draw out in particular?
Yeah, I quite, what stood out to me is that there's actually a real calling out of the state in there. They put him to death by hanging him on a tree. And I don't think we see that very often, quite as explicitly in the gospel. So, it gets clearly named that there is a political act of violence by the state in crucifying Jesus. And I mean, we could apply that to so many situations that we see just now. The state violence with ICE in the States just now, but also, states that are declaring war. So that might be Iran, but equally, we can look at Israel and Gaza. We can look at Russia and Ukraine. So many other situations where, people are just put in great danger, and so many people lose their lives. I read the UN Refugee Agency has warned that in Iran, just in the last 2 weeks, 3.2 million people were forced to flee their homes. Because in 2 weeks, that's more than half of the people of Scotland. That's incredible if you think about that. And if we put this in the context of Easter, where we should be celebrating new life, new hope, it's incredibly powerful to have that, to have it named like that this is violence that is political.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in verse 42, that reference to the judge of the living and the dead is particularly important when we think about that righteous judgment of all, encompassing all of this war and destruction that we see. I suspect many congregations around the country will not be feeling particularly hopeful this Easter for lots of good reasons, and that is helpful to frame that good news story as good in ways that really speak to us in the present moment too. Adam, is there anything else you'd like to come in on?
Not to move us on prematurely, but I think that
Mm.
does link into what I really pulled out in the next reading, which is the reading in Psalm 118. And the part that I really connected with is about the stone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. And this idea of like the builders rejecting and the power brokers and the stakeholders and the kind of the political and the heads of government and things rejecting people and Jesus in this example, but also how that maybe speaks to, and this is something I've have stuff to say on in the further readings as well, but speaks to how we as Christians advocate for change as well. That particularly my job is very related to kind of the political realities of changing policies and stances and things. But actually, there's a challenge here of to be like Jesus. Perhaps we do need to be outspoken enough and challenging enough that we will be rejected by kind of the leaders and those in power. But that's an important kind of role to play to also give that vision, speak into existence that vision of what we think a better world would look like, even if it doesn't look like a something that's particularly achievable in today's world and realities.
There is one verse in the Psalm that's not actually in the passage that the lectionary gives us. That's verse 9. It's better to trust in God than in princes, or to put your trust in God than in princes. And that's exactly what you were saying there, Adam. And I think that is really challenging because, we live in the world as it is, but then Jesus did too. And I don't think his world was necessarily less complex than ours. We obviously we are much more aware of what's going on in the wider world and all of that. And it can be really scary, and it can be easy to forget that we can trust in God and only rely on our own resources and on our leaders. And yes, to a degree, we need to do that, but we also need to do whatever we can to work for peace, even when it's hard to hold on to that hope.
Absolutely. I think that the theme of righteousness that's mentioned a couple of times, especially in sort of verse 20, that the righteous will enter through the gate of the Lord, should be a hopeful message for us, and we thinking about our clear moral duty for right and wrong. I think it's something that as JPIT we try and draw upon is the specific kind of Christian moral sensibility that we have to really call out right and wrong with a strong moral framework behind us. It's what makes Christians powerful actors within kind of civic society coalitions or in campaigns, is that we can be confident. We were talking the other day about one of our previous letters around refugee rights, began with the phrase, we are called as Christians to love our neighbor. And that is a very strong and powerful way to mark our territory, that we know who the righteous are, and we know what the gate of the Lord looks like. And that can be a really important part of our work, I think, as JPIT, in being really confident that we know right from wrong because Jesus shows us that way.
Mhm.
Is there anything else you'd like to talk about in the psalm in particular, either of you?
We again have that concreteness, I think, of the resurrection. Here we've got, I shall not die, but I shall live. I think that's something that goes through all of the readings. So, if you just look back briefly to Acts, in there, God raised him and allowed him to appear, and then they're eating and drinking together. It's so concrete, and that's what we'll see in the later readings as well. The stone is rolled away, the tomb is empty, the linen wrappings are left behind. It's not abstract, it is very concrete in here, which the resurrection is probably one of the aspects of our faith that a lot of people struggle with, in terms of, just how can this be true? How can he be risen? And all of these passages really talk about, this is how it is. It's not abstract. It's very concrete. Here are the tangible things that are left behind. And here he is, and you can touch him, you can hold on to him, you can eat and drink with him. And that's something that, is so much bigger than what we can imagine, I guess. And this is one of the big, mysteries of the faith, really.
I think we could look onto Colossians 3, verses 1 to 4, if you'd like. Great.
Mm-hmm.
And Aniko, would you like to start? Is there anything in particular you'd like to draw out from these verses? A short reading.
It is a very short reading, that's right. So again, we have Christ sitting at the right hand of God. So again, the resurrection theme that ties all of these passages really neatly together. They're quite clever with the lectionary, really, aren't they? But it's going back to what we said before, seek the things that are above. Trust in God rather than in worldly leaders. Don't just look at our human agendas. Look at what God's ideals are, and look to the guidance of God.
I think it links in as well with what you were saying, Thomas, about how Christians take part in campaigns for social change and things, and that seeking of the things that are above. We are always fixing our eyes on God's kingdom and on bringing about that here on earth, kind of knowing implicitly that is unlikely to happen in our own power, but it's something that we're always working towards. And I think there was an interesting thing a couple of months ago. There's a Trevor Noah, who is a US who's originally from South Africa, US TV show kind of host, but is also a Christian and talks there about how there is, particularly perhaps in progressive politics, some of the loss of religion, or the decline of some religiosity has weakened people's belief that things can get better and things can, that this ultimate kind of utopian vision of a better future doesn't exist, and everybody gets tied down, like I was saying before, in these kind of political realities of what is winnable in today's kind of system. But as Christians and of people of other faiths, we're particularly in this verse, we're told to seek the things that are above, to kind of it's easier perhaps for us to imagine those things because we have this resource of what that looks like and how we're called to enact that. Whereas I think for some other people we might work with, it is more about those kind of political realities, and in a time where I think politics is feeling slightly unhopeful, or I would add more than slightly unhopeful. But that is maybe something that we can bring to those spaces, is this kind of this ambition, I guess, a level of ambition beyond what others might be willing or able to imagine.
I think that's a great point. There's a couple of things I'd like to pick up on there, Adam, actually. There's this, it's really important to remember and kind of look back as well at this history of Christian involvement in radical change, around the world, and especially in the UK. If you look to things like the Diggers, or obviously, I mean, a famous example of the abolition of the slave trade, or of involvement more recently, our denominations within JPIT, involvement in racial justice work, in anti-apartheid work in South Africa, and now we might look to work with Palestinian Christians. So there's this real this motivates us to be able to think about change in a way that is distinct. I think that's a great example, and that Trevor Noah clip is really important. I'd recommend listeners have a look. Verse 4, the language of being revealed, and what is revealed to us, I think it links into that really nicely. That we are able to kind of vision this, and have something utopic within our faith, because when Christ, who is your life, is revealed to you, you are revealed to him in glory. We have this sense of connection, of relationship, that allows us to envision something different, that's still material. I think that what you said, Aniko, about the kind of the tangibility of the resurrection, is really important. That this is not it's not a vision based on kind of I don't know, our own imagination. It's based on the tangible reality that we see both in scripture, and in Christian tradition, and in the involvement of Christians in historical change, and radical change. Is there anything you'd like to add to that, Aniko?
No, I think we've really, sort of covered it.
I think that there's an interesting hierarchy in this passage as well, between kind of God, where God is above, and on earth, and that can be challenging. I think it's important to remember that obviously God is within us and among us, but I think it's also helpful, especially I've learned, for perhaps people with lived experience whose lives feel like hell on earth, and who don't feel a sense of liberation from the Christian message in their lives because of the marginalization or the poverty and violence that they face. It's really important to remember that there is something above as well, that there is something other than this. So having that tension is important.
And I love how that is picked up in the passage from John, because when we look at that, we've got the angels on the one hand, and then we've got Jesus standing there, and Mary thinks it's the gardener. And, it doesn't get much more earthly than a gardener working literally with the soil and all of that. And I think you again have that, you have the angels, the heavenly component, and you've got Jesus very much grounded there, as being, with us, living in the world, even after the resurrection. And I really love having that. So I really like what you picked up there, in the Colossians 1.
Well, let's look at the gospel passage then. Adam, would you like to start this time? Switch it up a bit. What's your initial takeaways from perhaps the passage?
Yeah, it is the passage, isn't it? And it's the passage for me in a couple of ways, maybe one of which I'll pause on and talk about if we have time. But I always think it's interesting, like you say, some of these things that are really kind of innocuous kind of phrases in this passage, but actually I think are really interesting. It talks about the disciples running to the grave and finding it empty, and then it just says, and then they went home, and then they just kind of they left, and I don't know if there's more to it than that. We're left to kind of imagine what they're doing, but they're just going home to live about their daily lives. We're not really it's not really entirely clear. Um, and it talks about them kind of understanding the scripture when they see the empty grave, that they kind of understand what has been prophesied and understand what has happened here. But that Mary perhaps doesn't understand that, and that is why she stays there weeping and hasn't made that kind of connection. Yeah, and then she says to who she assumes that is the gardener, but is actually Jesus, about, where have you taken his kind of body. Um, and so I think that's an interesting a challenge for us, and challenge for us as people who think about things theologically, that perhaps just our knowledge doesn't make us kind of better or more kind of worthy of the grace of Jesus's presence and things, that even that people who there's a faith and a full belief, but there's maybe a lack of understanding of how the kind of the exact scriptures and things and the technicalities around that. And then I think obviously this is a great verse for that powerful kind of inversion of historical norms, and that Jesus first appears to a woman and is first witnessed by a woman in a time where women couldn't give witnesses in court and things. And so I think again, I'm sure there's a million people better than me to speak of the kind of perhaps feminist narratives you can take out of this and that empowerment. But I think in general, again, it speaks back to that care and lack of kind of partiality or favoritism that we have in this situation, and that that Jesus appears and this happens to someone that it is unexpected to happen to.
Mm.
I think that's really interesting because I see it sort of the other way around. To the first bit of what you said, with Peter and John, they're running away, because I think, or I read it in the way of, they perhaps didn't understand really what was going on, and they go away and think about it, and then it slots in. Whereas for Mary, she stays behind because she wants to understand. She wants to see what's happening. Well, he's not here. Well, where is he? So she kind of wants to go deeper in that. So I think it's really interesting how we can read it, and interpret it in different ways. But yeah, for me, absolutely, about Jesus appearing to Mary, to the women first, telling her to go and tell the other disciples. So effectively commissioning her to be the first preacher of the resurrection. And yeah, very much in a time when women were seen as sort of second-class citizens, as unreliable, as you say, in court, And if you look at our society, we just had this the Louis Theroux documentary on the Manosphere, and adolescence last year. All of these things, I think there are parts of society that would quite like to see this very traditional gender stereotyping, and where women's witness would not be taken into account. And so we have that here as a very, very powerful counterpoint to that.
Yeah, I think I really like verse 16 to kind of that adds on to that, where Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned and said to him in Hebrew, Rabbi. That micro interaction is really important, of the turning. I think there's a bit of microsociology that says like the individual human interaction between like someone who calls and then someone who turns and responds, that the turning is like she is recognizing him again. She is able to come into his presence. And the first thing she says is Rabbi, and that we know that title, meaning teacher, so important for showing their relationship and showing that she kind of knew immediately. She knew just from her calling, him calling to her. That I think that interaction, I can really envisage it as something really significant that it says so much about Jesus in all of our lives, that Jesus, calls to us and we turn and look to him. And I think that's a really nice sort of vignette that shows for the whole scene in the garden. I think that's my favorite bit, is that just that little interaction, just the moment where she turns. That's kind of the moment where everything changes. Um, I think I really like what you've drawn out from that feminist angle of the importance of her being a woman in that moment as well, and that their relationship shows that equality, that you can imagine them almost at the same height as well. They're both standing in the garden as equal people. That would not have been a common interaction that any man and woman would have had, especially alone in a garden. That's really a really important part of the story, that we might overlook and rush into the next bit of what Jesus does next. But staying in the garden is really key. Sorry, go on.
They might still have had the two angels around, I suppose. We don't hear what's happening with them. But again, we have this, the concreteness, the tangibility. We see the linen wrappings. The other disciples going into the tomb, he saw and he believed by what was left behind, those wrappings. And Jesus speaking, like you said there, Adam, Jesus speaking to Mary and calling her name. It's not this kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Spectre. It's not a spectre that is there. It's not a ghost, He is standing there. He's talking to her. And yes, here in this passage, he's saying, don't hold on to me. I'm not ascended yet. I think if you look at the similar passage in Matthew's Gospel, talking about the resurrection, they do hold on to his feet. And we have this touch as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. Is there anything else you'd like to add, either of you, to our discussion of John?
I'm good.
Only that I think that I always find there's always the comedy in this passage of John inserting himself into the story as the person who can like run the fastest and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And I think I always think it's an interesting thing to have, and maybe shows their humanity and their temptation to self-aggrandize, but is also perhaps a reminder to us to not insert ourselves into the story, because I think to me it doesn't come across great for John to me, that he wants to kind of insert himself in this way. And so perhaps as we're doing our kind of activism, we've talked about over the decades about kind of being for us here, white saviors, or being people going out and doing this charitable work, or doing this kind of social action work, and centering narratives around kind of us and who we are and how great the things we've done are, but actually always giving that glory to God, and not pretending that we've done it under our own steam. That actually we're not the kind of central part of the story, and that actually our role in it is kind of to be conduits of that kind of that power and that message.
Okay, thank you both. I think we can draw it to a close. Thank you for listening, and I hope this episode helps you in your preaching prep for this particularly auspicious Sunday. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcast, and share this episode with your friends. We also have online spaces for further engagement and discussion about faith and politics on our social media platforms. And I'd like to say thank you to Adam and to Aniko for being with us today. I'm going to leave you with a closing reflection. I've taken this from the conclusion to the blog, An Easter Sunday, A Sacred Echo, Solidarity in a Small Hell of Our Own, from Paul J. Otuma, the Irish theologian and writer. He says, "Each year on Easter Sunday, I find myself moved, not because there is a happy ever after ending to all of our stories. It's quite clear there's not. I'm moved because of a sacred echo of a hope that there is solidarity for those who feel like we inhabit a small hell of our own experience. The hope of Easter doesn't damn this hell with a bleaching light. Rather, this hope enters and squats with us. The celebrations of Holy Week for me are not about cataclysmic resurrections, but about being moved to follow in the life of the Nazarene, bravely entering into loneliness with a small spring of consoling company. And a final blessing from St. Clare. Live without fear. Your Creator has made you holy, has always protected you, and loves you as a mother. Go in peace to follow the good road, and may God's blessing be with you always. Amen.
Amen.